The night was cruel and cold, the wind howled across the empty battlefield, carrying the smell of smoke and frozen blood. The ground was broken with deep scars of war, metal scraps buried in the snow, and silence heavier than death itself. A human named David walked slowly through the wasteland, his boots crunched on the ice, his breath came out like mist. He carried a small lantern, its weak light fighting against the darkness. He had no reason to be there except to search for anything useful. Wood, metal, food, anything that could help him survive another day. But then, in that silence, he heard something, a faint cry, almost too weak for the ear. He stopped, turned his head, and listened. At first he thought it was the wind playing tricks, yet the sound came again, soft, broken, almost like a whimper. David followed the sound, his heart beat faster as he pushed through broken piles of snow and shattered armor. Finally, under a half-buried metal plate, he saw a small figure. It was an alien girl, her skin pale with frost, her silver hair tangled with ice, her eyes half-closed, lips trembling. She was still alive. For a moment David froze. He had seen her kind before, proud, powerful, and merciless during the war. This girl looked nothing like the warriors. She was thin, weak, and dressed in nothing but torn cloth. Whoever left her here wanted her to die slowly in the cold. He knelt beside her. His gloved hand brushed the snow from her face. Her skin was burning cold. She whispered something in her own tongue, a sound filled with fear. Her small fingers tried to push him away. Weak and trembling, David's mind raced. He could turn away, leave her here, and walk back into the night. It was not his war, not his responsibility. But deep inside, he knew he couldn't. The thought of leaving her to die in the snow made his chest heavy. Easy now, he said softly. Thou. He knew she didn't understand his words. His voice was calm, warm, like a flame against the cold air. He took off his coat and wrapped it around her thin body. She shivered, but her eyes opened wider, watching him with confusion. He lifted her gently in his arms. She was light as a bundle of sticks, almost weightless. The cold bit into his skin, but he tightened his hold. Her head rested weakly against his chest. Her breath was shallow, fragile, but still there. The wind grew stronger as he walked back toward his small shelter. The cave was far, and every step felt heavier with the storm pressing against him. The snow stung his face, and his legs sank deeper into the drifts, but the sound of her faint breathing gave him strength. At one point, he slipped on ice and almost fell. The girl gave a small cry of pain. David's heart sank. He held her closer, whispering, "I've got you, don't give up." Even though she could not understand, the tone of his voice carried meaning. He looked down at her, her eyes half open, glowing faintly in the lantern light. She looked at him as if trying to understand why he carried her instead of leaving her. For a moment their eyes met, fragile trust hanging between them. The storm grew louder. Shadows of ruined machines rose around them. It was as if the world itself wanted to swallow them both. But David kept walking, step by step, fighting the cold and fear. At last, he reached the mouth of his hidden cave. He ducked inside, the warm air of the small fire hitting his frozen skin. Carefully, he laid the alien girl on a blanket. She coughed, her lips moving, whispering words he couldn't understand. David sat beside her, placing more wood on the fire. He could see her shaking, her body fighting to survive. He broke a piece of bread, soaked it in warm water, and tried to place it near her lips. She turned her face away at first. AFR. Aid, then slowly, her eyes returned to him, searching, weighing. Finally, she took a small bite, her hands still trembling. She looked at him again, her gaze filled with both fear and a question. Why was he helping her when her own people had abandoned her? David didn't answer. He only sat quietly, watching her breathe. He knew one thing. He had found her in the frozen night, and he would not walk away. The storm outside roared like a beast, but inside the cave, a fragile spark of hope had been lit, a spark that neither the wind nor the cold could put out. The cave was small and rough, its walls wet with dripping ice. A weak fire burned in the corner, sending shadows dancing across the stone. David set the girl near the flames, wrapping her in his extra blanket. She shivered, her breath uneven, but slowly the color of her skin returned. David sat across from her, his hands stretched toward the warmth. His eyes kept drifting back to her. She was still watching him, her silver eyes flickering with fear. Every time he moved, she tensed as if ready to run. though her weak body had no strength left. He spoke softly, even though he knew she could not understand. "You'll be all right now." His voice echoed against the walls, gentle, calm. The girl tilted her head, confused by the sound. She whispered something in her alien tongue, the words like broken glass yet soft like wind. David shook his head. "I don't know your words," he admitted quietly. His face softened, and for a moment silence filled the cave. Only the fire crackled and the storm outside screamed. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small piece of bread, stale but edible. He broke it carefully, soaking it in warm water, and placed it near her lips again. At first she turned her face away, her pride or fear stronger than hunger. David sighed and placed the food on a flat stone beside her. Minutes passed, the fire flickered lower. Finally, the girl's trembling hands reached out. She picked the bread slowly, her fingers and shaking. She took a tiny bite, her eyes darting toward David as if expecting him to snatch it away. When he didn't move, she ate more, little by little. David smiled faintly, relief warming him more than the fire. He pulled out a water flask and offered it to her. She hesitated, then drank, the sound of her swallowing soft but steady. "Good," he whispered to himself. "Stay strong." The girl coughed once, then curled into the blanket, her eyes half closed, but still she did not let him out of her sight. David leaned back against the stone wall, exhaustion dragging at his bones. He had carried her through the storm, and now he felt the weight of every step. For a while, he watched the fire burn, his thoughts restless. Why had her people left her? Was she unwanted, a burden, or something worse? He didn't know, and maybe he never would. Yet when he looked at her fragile form, he felt the answer didn't matter. Suddenly, a sound outside made him sit up. Snow crunched under heavy boots. Faint but close. David's hand went to the knife on his belt. His heart beat hard. He moved quickly to the cave's entrance and listened. Voices carried through the storm, rough and sharp. He could not understand their language, but their tone was cruel. Searching, hunting. David's eyes narrowed. They were not travelers. They were patrols. He returned quickly to the girl. She was awake, her body tense, her eyes wide with terror. She whispered something urgent, her voice shaking. She pointed toward the cave mouth and then shook her head violently. "Quiet," David whispered, pressing a finger to his lips. He moved the fire deeper into the cave, covering the glow with stones. Darkness swallowed them. The girl clung to the blanket, her small body shaking not from the cold but from fear. The voices outside grew louder. A shadow passed across the cave mouth. David held his breath, grip his knife tightly. The girl covered her mouth with trembling hands to keep from making a sound. Minutes stretched like hours. The patrol's footsteps moved past, fading slowly into the storm. Only when silence returned did David breathe again. He turned back to the girl. She was staring at him, her eyes filled with fear and something else. "Trust." He crouched beside her, his voice low. "You're safe," he said, even though danger was still close. She blinked at him, then whispered her name, soft as falling snow. "Lyra." David froze. Her voice was fragile, but the name was clear. It was the first bridge between them. He repeated it gently. "Lyra." She gave the smallest nod, her lips trembling. The storm outside howled like a beast, but inside the cave, a new thread had been tied, fragile but real. She was no longer just a stranger in the snow. She had a name, and he had chosen to protect her. As the night dragged on, Lyra finally closed her eyes, her breathing steadier now. David stayed awake, guarding the fire, guarding her. He knew the patrols would return. He knew danger was not over, but in that small shelter, with the storm pressing outside, he felt a new duty settle on his shoulders. They had left her to die, but he would not walk away. The storm ended with a gray dawn. The world outside the cave was quiet but heavy, snow covering the battlefield like a white shroud. David stepped out for a moment, scanning the horizon. His breath turned to mist in the freezing air, and his eyes searched for movement. Nothing. Only silence and broken machines buried under snow. When he returned inside, Lyra was awake. Her silver eyes followed him with fear but also a strange calm. She was no longer as pale as the night before, though she still looked weak. David handed her a small piece of dried meat. She took it carefully, her thin hands shaking, and ate slowly. But peace did not last long. In the distance, carried by the wind, came faint echoes, metallic thuds. sharp voices. David stiffened. He moved to the cave's mouth again, narrowing his eyes. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, but then he saw them. Dark figures moved across the snow, their armor shining faintly. A patrol, 6 maybe 7 soldiers, their weapons ready, their tracks cut through the frozen ground, leading toward the ruins not far from the cave. David cursed under his breath. He knew they were searching, not for food, not for scrap, but for someone. He looked back at Lyra. Her face had gone pale again. She was shaking her head, whispering fast words in her own tongue. Her fear was clear. They were hunting her. David quickly smothered the fire, covering the embers with snow from the wall. Darkness filled the cave once more. He motioned for silence, pressing a finger to his lips. Lyra obeyed, curling into the blanket, her eyes wide. The footsteps grew closer. The crunch of boots in snow echoed in David's chest. He gripped his knife tightly, his body tense like a coiled spring. Outside, voices barked orders. Searching. One of the soldiers paused near the cave mouth. His shadow fell across the snow. David held his breath. Lyra pressed her hands against her mouth, trying not to make a sound. Every second stretched long, heavy, unbearable. The soldier's head turned toward the cave. He stepped closer, the tip of his weapon brushing snow. David's pulse thundered. He was ready to strike, ready to fight if the man entered. But then, another voice called out from farther away. The soldier hesitated, then turned back. He moved on, his footsteps fading. Only when the sounds were gone did David exhale. He looked back at Lyra. She was staring at him, her silver eyes wide, filled with terror but also relief. He knelt beside her and whispered, "Safe, for now." Even though he wasn't sure, Lyra reached out slowly, her small hand gripping his sleeve. Her voice trembled. "Lyra, hide." She had earned one human word. "Hide." David nodded, touched by the effort. "Yes, hide," he whispered back. For hours they remained silent, afraid the soldiers might return. David listened to every sound, every gust of wind. His mind raced with plans. He knew the cave was no longer safe. If the patrol searched deeper next time, they would be found. As the day dragged on, Lyra grew restless. She whispered again, her voice soft but urgent. He could not understand most of her words, but he caught one repeated sound. Chained. She mimed with her wrists, showing invisible bonds. David's jaw tightened. He understood. They had abandoned her not just to die, but as punishment. When night fell again, David made his decision. They had to move. He packed his few belongings, tied them together with rope, and wrapped Lyra in the thickest blanket he had. She looked at him with confusion, fear in her eyes. He pointed to the horizon. "We leave," he said firmly. She shook her head at first, afraid of the snow and the soldiers. But when he offered his hand, steady and strong, she slowly took it, her thin fingers wrapped around his gloved palm. The trust between them had grown, fragile but real. They stepped out into the cold night, the moon lighting the snow like silver. Their footprints trailed behind them, long shadows following. Every sound made David tense. Every crack of ice reminded him they were being hunted. At one point, Lyra stumbled, her body still weak. David lifted her easily, carrying her in his arms once more. She buried her face against his chest, whispering his name for the first time. "David." The sound was broken, but it reached him like fire in the dark. His heart tightened. She trusted him enough to speak his name. In that moment, he swore silently that he would not fail her. Behind them, faint in the distance, the sound of soldiers echoed again. They were still searching, still hunting, but David kept walking, his grip on Lyra firm. The silent pursuit had begun, and he knew it would not end until one of them was caught. The snow crunched softly under David's boots as dawn crept over the frozen hills. He had carried Lyra through the night, her fragile body pressed close against his chest. Her breathing had steadied, but exhaustion weighed heavy on her small frame. When the first light touched the world, David found a cluster of rocks that formed a shallow hollow. It was not much, but it would hide them for a little while. He set Lyra down gently on a flat stone. She looked pale but her eyes were open, watching him with quiet trust. David knelt and built a tiny fire from dry twigs he had carried. The flame was weak but warm enough to fight the morning chill. For a moment, they sat in silence. The storm of the last days still echoed in their minds. David studied her carefully, her skin marked with faint scars, her wrists bruised as if once bound by iron. It made his chest tighten with anger. She had not just been abandoned, she had been treated as less than nothing. To distract her from the cold, David pulled out a small stick and began showing her how he carved wood into shapes. Slowly, carefully, he whittled the stick until it resembled a bird with open wings. He placed it in her hands. Lyra blinked, her thin fingers tracing the rough carving. A soft sound escaped her lips, almost a laugh. It was the first time David had seen her smile. Encouraged, he began teaching her little things. He showed her how to melt snow in a tin cup over the fire so she could drink. He showed her how to set a simple snare trap by bending a branch and tying rope. At first she only watched, but then, with shaky hands, she copied him. Her first attempt failed, the rope snapping loose. She frowned, her silver eyes dark with frustration. David chuckled softly. Try again. His voice calm and patient, he guided her fingers, step by step, until the snare stood ready. Lyra's eyes widened with pride. She pointed to it and whispered his name, David. The sound was stronger this time, warmer. That single moment lit something inside him. She was learning, trusting, growing beside him. It was no longer about just saving her life. It was about giving her one. As the day stretched on, they tested the snare and caught a small rabbit. Lyra gasped softly when she saw it. Her eyes filled with sadness. David crouched beside her, showing her how survival sometimes meant hard choices. Together they prepared the meat, roasting it over the fire. She ate slowly, but for the first time her body seemed to gain strength, yet danger still lingered beyond the rocks. Twice during the day David spotted distant figures moving across the snow, dark shapes against the pale horizon. The patrols were widening their search. Lyra noticed too, and fear returned to her eyes. She whispered the word again, hide, clutching his sleeve tightly. That night, as the fire burned low, David heard her speaking softly to herself in her own language. Her words carried a tone of sorrow and longing, though he could not understand. He watched her curl up beside the flame, holding the little wooden bird close to her chest as if it were a treasure. Sleep came slowly to David, his mind restless with thoughts of what lay ahead. He knew they could not stay here long. The patrols would find them if they remained. He needed a plan, a path to safety, somewhere beyond the reach of soldiers. When he finally drifted into uneasy rest, a sound woke him, a faint rustle at the edge of the hollow. He gripped his knife and rose quietly, stepping outside into the moonlight. The world was silent, only the whisper of wind over snow. His eyes scanned the distance, and then he saw it, shadows moving again, closer this time. He returned to the fire quickly, his face grim. Lyra's eyes opened, and she sat up, reading the fear on his face. She whispered his name again, her voice trembling. David knelt beside her, resting a steady hand on her shoulder. We'll be all right, he said, even though the weight of danger pressed hard against him. In that moment, Lyra reached up and placed her small hand over his. Her touch was gentle, but it carried strength. She whispered one word slowly, as if trying to say it in his language, family. David froze, his heart heavy with emotion. She had given him more than trust, more than hope. She had given him belonging. In the frozen wasteland where both of them were alone, they had built something neither had before. The night deepened, the shadows of soldiers creeping closer with each passing hour. But inside the hollow, beside the faint glow of the fire, a bond stronger than fear was born, a bond of survival, of trust, and of family. The food was running low. The hollow among the rocks had given them shelter for a few days, but David knew they could not stay forever. His traps caught little, and the girl, Lyra, needed more than scraps to recover her strength. Her cheeks were still pale, and though she was stronger than when he first found her, she was still fragile. At dawn, David made a choice. He needed supplies, firewood, food, and warmer clothes for her. The nearest settlement was a half-day's walk south. It was small, filled with traders, mercenaries, and those who lived on the edges of war. He had been there before, never welcomed but tolerated. He crouched beside Lyra before leaving. Her silver eyes looked at him with worry. She clutched the little wooden bird he had carved for her, shaking her head. She did not want him to go. David touched her shoulder gently. I'll come back, he promised. Though she could not understand the words, she seemed to understand the tone. Her lips pressed tight, and she whispered his name, David, like a plea. The walk to the settlement was long. The snow crunched under his boots, and the wind carried distant echoes of soldiers moving through the land. He kept his hood low when he entered the market. The air smelled of smoke and sweat, merchants shouting prices, bartering loudly. David traded some metal scraps and rabbit skins for bread, dried fish, and a thicker blanket. He kept his voice quiet and his answers short. He had survived here before by not drawing attention, but this time something felt different. Eyes lingered on him longer than usual. Conversations hushed when he passed. Near the edge of the market, a man with a scar across his cheek leaned against a stall, watching David. The man smirked, muttering to another trader. David caught the words, hiding something. His stomach tightened. He ignored them, walking faster, but he could feel the weight of their stares. As he left, footsteps followed. He turned a corner into a narrow street, and the man with the scar stepped out, blocking his way. "You've been keeping to yourself too much," the man said with a sly grin. "People say you've got more than scraps in those caves of yours." David's hand went to the knife at his belt. "I have nothing," he said flatly, trying to push past, but the man grabbed his arm, leaning closer. "Word is soldiers are paying good coin for a runaway." His eyes gleamed. "Silver hair, pale skin, ring a bell?" David's blood ran cold. He shoved the man back hard and walked away without another word. He could hear laughter behind him, low and mocking, but the damage was done. The rumor had spread, and soon it would reach the patrols. He hurried out of the settlement, clutching the supplies tight. His mind raced. The market had given him what he needed, but it had also placed a knife at his back. Every step back toward the hollow felt heavier. The snow seemed quieter, as if holding its breath. When he returned, Lyra was waiting, her eyes lit with relief the moment she saw him. She rushed forward, weak but determined, and clung to his sleeve. David smiled faintly, handing her bread and wrapping the thicker blanket around her. She ate quickly, her face softening with comfort, but David's eyes kept going to the cave entrance, his ears straining for sounds. He explained softly, though she could not understand. "We have to move." She tilted her head, confused, but his serious tone made her nod slowly. That night, as the fire burned low, David thought he heard it again, footsteps in the snow, faint but real. His knife was in his hand instantly. Lyra stirred, whispering his name, fear in her voice. He motioned for silence, listening hard. Voices drifted through the darkness outside, sharper than the market traders, heavier with command. Soldiers, they were here already. David's jaw clenched. He realized then the truth. Someone at the settlement had betrayed him, the man with the scar, maybe others too. They had traded whispers for silver, selling both him and Lyra into danger. He packed quickly, throwing supplies into his bag. He lifted Lyra into his arms, her eyes wide with fear but trusting. The voices outside grew closer, torches flickering against the night. As David slipped through a narrow path out the back of the hollow, he knew their fragile peace was gone. The betrayal in the market had unleashed the hunters once more. Lyra buried her face against his chest, whispering one word again and again, "Hide, hide, hide." Her trembling voice cut through the night. David tightened his grip on her, his heart burning with fury and determination. "They'll never take you," he whispered, his words carried away by the wind. The snow swallowed their footprints as they fled into the dark, the sound of soldiers chasing close behind. The night air burned with cold, but David barely felt it. His legs pounded against the snow, his breath tearing through his chest. Behind him, the sound of soldiers grew louder, crunching boots, shouted orders, the sharp bark of commands. They were close, too close. Lyra clung to him as he ran, her thin arms tight around his neck. Her face was buried against his chest, trembling with every step. David carried her with all the strength he had, refusing to slow, refusing to stumble. He could not let them take her, not after all she had endured. The forested slope loomed ahead, dark pines bending under heavy snow. David veered into it, hoping the thick trees would hide their trail. Branches whipped against his face, snow cascaded down as he shoved his way through. His boots sank deep into the drifts, but he pushed harder. Behind them came the flare of torchlight, bobbing between the trees, soldiers shouting, their voices sharp in the frozen night. A blast from a weapon lit the darkness with a crack, snow exploding where the shot struck. Lyra cried out softly, clutching him tighter. "Hold on," David whispered, his voice ragged. He ducked behind a fallen tree, crouching low. His breath came fast, but he forced it quiet. The torches moved past in the distance, shadows sliding across the snow. He waited, every muscle trembling, until the sounds faded, but it was only a matter of time before they doubled back. He knew soldiers never gave up so easily. He needed distance, he needed higher ground. Carefully, he shifted Lyra onto his back, securing her with rope so his hands were free. She whispered his name against his shoulder, David, her voice broken but steady. He started up the mountain path, icy and steep. Each step was a battle, the snow deep, the rocks sharp, his fingers numb as he pulled himself upward. Lyra's small weight pressed against his back, but he carried her as if she weighed nothing. The thought of leaving her was unthinkable. Hours blurred into each other. The chase did not end. Sometimes he saw torches far below, moving like fireflies across the white valley. Sometimes he heard the distant echo of hounds, their howls chilling the blood. Always closer, always hunting. At dawn, the storm returned. Snow whipped across the mountainside, stinging his face. The wind howled like a beast. Cover their tracks, but also stealing his strength. Lyra shivered violently against him. Her lips moved, whispering words in her language, prayers maybe. Her fragile voice gave him courage. He spotted a cave ahead, a dark mouth in the mountain. He stumbled inside, falling to his knees. The cold stone pressed against him, but at least the wind was gone. Gently, he lowered Lyra onto a blanket. She looked pale, her silver eyes glazed with exhaustion. David lit a small fire, shielding the smoke with rocks. He pressed his hands against hers, warming her thin fingers. She looked at him weakly and whispered one word, family. Her voice trembled, but her eyes were steady. His throat tightened. He squeezed her hand firmly. Yes, family, he said, even though she barely understood. The moment did not last. A shout echoed faintly from below. The soldiers had reached the base of the mountain. The sound bounced up through the cliffs. David's heart pounded. They were running out of time. He packed quickly, his mind racing. Escape higher was dangerous, the cliffs too steep, but staying here meant death. He slung the supplies onto his shoulder and lifted Lyra once more. Her eyes closed, but her small hand gripped his coat, trusting him blindly. As he stepped back into the storm, the world seemed ready to break. Snow blasted across the cliffs, his boots slipping on the ice. The soldiers' torches flickered below like fire demons rising. Shots cracked through the wind, one striking the rock near his head, shards cutting his cheek. He didn't stop. They reached a narrow ridge, the path ending in a sharp cliff. The valley stretched below, deep and endless. David's breath froze in his chest. He turned. The soldiers were climbing after him, their shouts growing louder. He had nowhere left to run, nowhere left to hide. Lyra stirred weakly in his arms, whispering again, David, as if egging him not to give up. David's jaw tightened, his body stood firm against the storm. If this was where they made their stand, so be it. He would fight every last breath to keep her safe. The soldiers closed in, their armor gleaming in the storm's light, weapons raised. David drew his knife, planting his boots against the ice. The storm howled, the torches flared, and the desperate escape came to its breaking point. The ridge shook under the storm, snow whipped across the cliff, blinding David's eyes. He stood tall with Lyra in his arms, facing the line of soldiers climbing toward them. Torches burned in the wind, weapons raised, voices shouting commands. The soldiers believed they had cornered prey. David's breath came hard, his knife trembling in his hand, but not from fear. His body was ready, his heart steady. He would not surrender her. He could die here, but he would not give her back to those who had left her to freeze in the snow. Lyra stirred against his chest, her silver eyes opened weakly, catching the glow of torches below. She saw the soldiers climbing closer, their armor dark and cold. She whispered one word again, broken but strong, family. Her small hand clutched his coat, her trust binding him stronger than iron. David looked down at her and felt the fire in his chest burn hotter than the storm around him. He turned toward the soldiers, his voice low but unshaken. You'll never take her. They could not hear his words over the wind, but his stance spoke for him. The first soldier reached the ridge, weapon drawn. He lunged forward, but David struck with his knife, forcing him back. The man slipped on the ice, falling with a cry into the abyss below. The others shouted, anger and fear mixing. More climbed up, their blades flashing in the storm. David fought fiercely, his movements raw but desperate, each strike, each step was not for himself but for the fragile girl he carried. His arm burned, his body weakened, but his will held strong. He could not lose, not now, not here. Then something unexpected happened. Lyra, shivering and pale, pushed herself from his chest. Her eyes glowed faintly, brighter than the storm. She raised her trembling hands, and for the first time David saw what her people had feared. Light burst from her skin, silver patterns glowing across her arms. The snow around them shone as if the moon had fallen to earth. The soldiers stopped, their shouts dying into silence. Fear spread across their faces. They knew what she was. They had not left her behind because she was weak, they had abandoned her because she was different. The ridge shook under the storm, snow whipped across the cliff, blinding David's eyes. He stood tall with Lyra in his arms, facing the line of soldiers climbing toward them. Torches burned in the wind, weapons raised, voices shouting commands. The soldiers believed they had cornered prey. David's breath came hard, his knife trembling in his hand, but not from fear. His body was ready, his heart steady. He would not surrender her. He could die here, but he would not give her back to those who had left her to freeze in the snow. Lyra stirred against his chest, her silver eyes opened weakly, catching the glow of torches below. She saw the soldiers climbing closer, their armor dark and cold. She whispered one word again, broken but strong, family. Her small hand clutched his coat, her trust binding him stronger than iron. David looked down at her and felt the fire in his chest burn hotter than the storm around him. He turned toward the soldiers, his voice low but unshaken. You'll never take her. They could not hear his words over the wind, but his stance spoke for him. The first soldier reached the ridge, weapon drawn. He lunged forward, but David struck with his knife, forcing him back. The man slipped on the ice, falling with a cry into the abyss below. The others shouted, anger and fear mixing. More climbed up, their blades flashing in the storm. David fought fiercely, his movements raw but desperate. Each strike, each step was not for himself but for the fragile girl he carried. His arm burned, his body weakened, but his will held strong. He could not lose, not now, not here. Then something unexpected happened. Lyra, shivering and pale, pushed herself from his chest. Her eyes glowed faintly, brighter than the storm. She raised her trembling hands, and for the first time David saw what her people had feared. Light burst from her skin, silver patterns glowing across her arms. The snow around them shone as if the moon had fallen to earth. The soldiers stopped, their shouts dying into silence. Fear spread across their faces. They knew what she was. They had not left her behind because she was weak. They had abandoned her because she was different. Lyra's voice rose, soft but echoing. She spoke in her alien tongue, the words flowing like a song carried by the storm. The glow from her body spread, the snow whipping into a whirlwind around her. The soldiers staggered back, their torches flickering, weapons lowering. David shielded his eyes but did not move away from her. His heart pounded, but not with fear, only awe. She was no longer the fragile child he had carried through the storm. She was something more, something powerful, yet still looking at him with trust. The soldiers shouted, panic breaking their discipline. Some fled back down the cliff. Others dropped their weapons in terror. Only a few remained, too stubborn or too loyal to retreat. But even they hesitated under the glow of Lyra's light. David stepped forward, standing at her side, knife still ready. His voice cut through the storm. She is not yours. The words carried no translation, but the soldiers understood his defiance. The last of the patrol turned and fled, leaving the ridge silent except for the storm. The glow around Lyra faded slowly, her strength draining with it. She swayed, her body trembling. David caught her in his arms before she collapsed. He lowered her gently onto the snow, brushing her hair from her face. Her eyes opened weakly, her lips forming one final word, David. Her voice soft but filled with something more than fear, filled with love. David's chest tightened. He pressed his forehead against hers, whispering, you're safe, I promise. I'll never leave you. The storm raged on, but the danger had passed. They were alone on the ridge, alive. Together. The soldiers who had chased them were gone, and the ones who had abandoned her would never touch her again. David looked down at the fragile girl in his arms, no longer just a stranger, no longer just someone he had saved in pity. She was family now, bound not by blood but by choice, by survival, by love. As he carried her down the mountain at dawn, the sky broke with the first light of day. The snow glittered gold under the rising sun. David felt the weight of the night lift. The world was still dangerous, but for the first time, he felt hope. They had tried to erase her, to leave her to die, but he had chosen differently. He had chosen humanity, not the kind of humanity that abandoned, but the kind that gave, that protected, that loved, and because of that choice, neither of them would ever walk alone again.